He thought humiliating her in front of everyone would elevate his reputation, but he had no idea that in less than 10 minutes, his own name would be the one whispered in quiet disbelief across the entire campus. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or state in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and fairness, make sure to follow along, because stories like this have a way of revealing truths we often overlook. Now, back to Emily Carter. The lecture hall at Westbridge University was already filled to capacity, rows of polished wooden seats rising like a stage set for something far more dramatic than an academic seminar. Sunlight filtering through tall windows and reflecting off the marble floors in a soft golden hue. At the center of it all stood Professor Daniel Whitmore, a man whose reputation stretched far beyond the campus, known for his brilliance, his precision, and his quiet intolerance for anyone he deemed beneath his intellectual standard. His tailored navy suit, silver cufflinks, and measured tone commanded attention the moment he began speaking, and the room followed his every word as if it were law. Near the back row, almost invisible among the crowd, sat Emily Carter, her simple gray cardigan draped neatly over her shoulders, her notebook resting quietly in her lap. At 38, she carried herself with a calm that most overlooked, her presence so understated that even those seated beside her barely registered she was there. She had been working in the university's administrative office for over 6 months, organizing files, managing schedules, and blending seamlessly into the background of a world that rarely acknowledged her existence. But what no one in that room knew was that Emily had once stood at the front of lecture halls just like this one, years ago, before life had taken a quieter turn, before she chose a path that required less recognition and far more silence. As Whitmore continued his presentation, confidently outlining a complex theoretical framework that had earned him national acclaim, Emily's eyes followed each line on the projection screen with quiet focus, her fingers gently tapping against her notebook as if tracing patterns only she could see. Then it happened, almost imperceptibly at first, a small shift in her expression, the kind that would go unnoticed by anyone who wasn't paying attention. A single detail, buried deep within the professor's explanation, didn't align. It was subtle, technical, the kind of inconsistency most would never catch. But to Emily, it stood out with undeniable clarity. She hesitated for a moment, her gaze lowering as if weighing something far heavier than a simple question. The room was silent except for Whitmore's voice, confident and unwavering, echoing across the hall. And then, almost against her own instinct, Emily raised her hand. It was a small gesture, barely noticeable at first, but in a room that revered authority, it was enough to shift the air. Whitmore paused mid-sentence, his eyes scanning the audience until they landed on her, a flicker of curiosity quickly replaced by something sharper, something more deliberate. "Yes?" he said, his tone controlled but edged with impatience. Emily's voice, when it came, was soft but steady. "I believe there might be a small inconsistency in the 4th step of your model." For a split second, the room held its breath. And in that moment, without realizing it, Professor Daniel Whitmore had just been handed the opportunity that would quietly dismantle everything he had built. The silence that followed her words was not immediate. It unfolded slowly, like a ripple spreading across still water, subtle at first, and then impossible to ignore as heads began to turn, eyes narrowing, expressions shifting from passive interest to quiet anticipation, and for a brief moment, no one spoke, as if the entire room was waiting to see how Professor Whitmore would respond to something so unexpected, so out of place. His gaze lingered on Emily, studying her in a way that was no longer casual, no longer indifferent, but measured, deliberate, and edged with something far less patient. He adjusted his stance slightly, one hand resting against the podium, the other holding the remote control for the presentation, his posture still composed, but his expression tightening just enough for those closest to notice. "An inconsistency," he repeated, his voice calm, though the faintest hint of amusement slipped through, the kind that suggested disbelief more than curiosity. A few students exchanged glances, subtle smirks forming, as if the situation itself was already becoming entertainment. Emily remained seated, her posture straight, her hands resting lightly on her notebook, her eyes steady, not challenging, not apologizing, simply present. "Yes," She replied quietly, her tone unchanged, as if she were pointing out something ordinary, something factual, rather than stepping into a space that clearly did not belong to her. Whitmore exhaled softly through his nose, a quiet sound that carried more weight than any raised voice could have. He stepped away from the podium, his polished shoes echoing faintly against the marble floor as he moved closer to the edge of the stage, narrowing the distance between himself and the audience, between himself and her. "And which department are you from?" he asked, tilting his head slightly, his voice now carrying a sharper clarity, one that projected easily to the back of the hall. Emily hesitated, not out of fear, but out of an awareness that the answer would change everything about how this moment unfolded. "I work in administrative services," she said. The reaction was immediate, though restrained, a low ripple of quiet laughter, whispers passing between rows like a current, not loud enough to disrupt the room, but loud enough to be felt. Whitmore's lips curved, not quite a smile, but something close, something colder. "Administrative services," he repeated, letting the words settle, letting the implication hang in the air longer than necessary. He turned slightly, glancing back at the projection screen, then back at her, as if weighing the absurdity of the situation. "And you believe you have identified a flaw in a model that has been peer-reviewed, published, and presented at 3 national conferences." His tone was still controlled, but now unmistakably condescending, each word carefully placed, not to seek clarification, but to frame the moment for everyone watching. Emily did not respond immediately. Her fingers rested still against the page, the faint tapping from earlier gone, replaced by a quiet stillness that seemed almost deliberate. Around her, the energy in the room shifted, attention sharpening, anticipation building, the atmosphere no longer passive but charged, waiting. Whitmore took another step forward, his presence filling the space, his voice lowering just slightly, forcing the room to lean in. "Tell me," he continued, "what exactly did you notice?" The question sounded open, but the tone beneath it carried a challenge, an invitation wrapped in something far less generous. A few students leaned back in their seats, others leaned forward, phones subtly lifted, as if sensing that something unusual was about to unfold. Emily lifted her gaze fully now, meeting his eyes without hesitation, without defiance, just calm clarity. And in that moment, something unspoken shifted again, something Whitmore did not yet recognize, but would soon understand far too well. Emily's voice did not rise to meet the tension in the room. It remained steady, measured, almost quiet enough that those in the back rows leaned forward instinctively, drawn not by volume, but by something far more compelling. "In your 4th step," she began, her eyes briefly flicking to the projection screen before returning to Whitmore. "The variable substitution assumes a level of stability that does not hold when applied to boundary conditions beyond the initial range." A pause followed, not from hesitation, but precision, as if she were placing each word exactly where it belonged. Specifically, the transformation creates a contradiction when extended to nonlinear intervals, which means the conclusion only appears consistent within a limited scope. The room did not react immediately, as if the weight of what she had said needed a second to land, to be processed, to be understood. Whitmore's expression remained composed, but something in his eyes sharpened, the faintest flicker of irritation breaking through the polished surface of his confidence. He did not interrupt her, but the slight tightening of his jaw betrayed a shift, subtle, but unmistakable. "That is quite a claim," he replied, his tone smooth, though now carrying a deliberate edge. He turned slightly, glancing at the screen as if reconsidering his own work, then back at her, his posture straightening as though preparing to reclaim control of the room. "And you arrived at this conclusion from your position in administrative services." A few more restrained laughs slipped through the audience, quieter this time, but still present, still feeding the atmosphere he was carefully shaping. Emily did not acknowledge them. "It is not about the position," she said calmly. "It is about the structure of the model." Whitmore let out a soft breath, almost a chuckle, though it carried no warmth. He stepped fully away from the podium now, closing the distance further, his presence dominating the front of the hall as he clasped his hands loosely in front of him. "Well then," he said, his voice projecting with renewed authority, "perhaps you would be willing to demonstrate this inconsistency for us." The words were framed as an invitation, but the tone beneath them was unmistakable, calculated, performative, designed not to explore her claim, but to expose it. A murmur moved through the room, the energy shifting again, anticipation building into something sharper, more expectant. Several students straightened in their seats. Others exchanged knowing looks, as if the outcome had already been decided. Whitmore gestured toward the stage with an open hand, his expression now composed into something almost welcoming, though his eyes told a different story. "Please," he added, "come up and walk us through your reasoning." The air seemed to tighten, the distance between the back row and the front suddenly feeling far greater than it had moments before. Emily remained still for a second, her gaze dropping briefly to her notebook, not searching for notes, but grounding herself in something familiar, something steady. Around her, the whispers had quieted, replaced by a watchful silence that pressed in from every direction. This was no longer a question. It was a moment being constructed, carefully, deliberately, with an audience ready to witness whatever came next. Emily closed her notebook gently, the soft sound barely audible, yet somehow distinct in the stillness. She rose to her feet without haste, without visible tension, her movements controlled, deliberate, as if she had already accepted what this moment required of her. And as she stepped into the aisle, every eye in the room followed, unaware that what they were about to witness would not unfold the way anyone expected. The sound of her footsteps was soft against the polished floor, but in the stillness of the lecture hall, each step carried weight, drawing every eye toward her as she made her way down the aisle, past rows of students who now leaned slightly aside to watch her pass, their earlier amusement fading into something quieter, more uncertain. Emily did not rush, did not hesitate, her pace steady, her gaze forward, as if the distance between her and the stage was not something to cross, but something to measure. At the front, Professor Whitmore stood waiting, one hand resting lightly against the edge of the podium, his posture relaxed, almost casual, though his eyes remained fixed on her with a sharp, expectant focus. He stepped aside just enough to give her space, gesturing toward the large whiteboard beside the projection screen. "Take your time," he said, his voice carrying easily through the room, though the faintest trace of condescension lingered beneath the surface. A few quiet chuckles echoed, and then quickly disappeared, replaced by a tension that seemed to settle over the room like a thin layer of glass. Emily reached the stage and paused for a brief moment, her eyes moving to the board, then to the projected model behind it, taking in the structure, the sequence, the details that most had already accepted without question. She picked up the marker from the tray, turning it once in her fingers, not as a nervous gesture, but as if aligning her thoughts with the tool in her hand. Behind her, Whitmore clasped his hands together again, his expression composed, though his gaze never left her, as if waiting for the moment she would falter. "Whenever you are ready," he added, his tone light, almost encouraging, though the room understood the implication beneath it. Emily nodded slightly, more to herself than to him, and stepped closer to the board. For a second, nothing happened. No movement, no words, just a quiet stillness that stretched long enough to make the audience shift in their seats. And then she began. Her first line was simple, precise, written with a confidence that did not announce itself, but revealed itself in the absence of hesitation. She did not start by correcting Whitmore's work directly. Instead, she reconstructed the foundation, step by step, rewriting the initial framework with subtle adjustments that, to an untrained eye, might have seemed insignificant. But as the lines formed, as the structure took shape, something began to change. A few students leaned forward, their expressions tightening, their attention sharpening as they followed the progression. Emily's hand moved steadily, each step flowing into the next without pause, without second-guessing, her earlier quiet presence now replaced by a focused clarity that filled the space more powerfully than any raised voice could have. Whitmore's posture shifted almost imperceptibly, his weight adjusting as his eyes moved between the board and the projection, tracking her changes, measuring them against his own work. The faint confidence in his expression did not disappear, but it flickered, just for a moment, as if something had caught him off guard. Emily continued, her voice calm as she spoke through the logic of each transition, not performing, not explaining for approval, but simply stating what was there, what had always been there, waiting to be seen. And as the structure unfolded, the room grew quieter still, the earlier whispers gone completely now, replaced by a silence that no longer belonged to doubt, but to realization, though no one was ready to name it yet. Emily's marker did not slow, but the room seemed to, every second stretching as her reconstruction of the model began to reveal something deeper than a simple correction, something structural, something undeniable. She paused briefly at the fourth step, the exact point she had mentioned earlier, and without looking back at Professor Whitmore, she adjusted a single variable, a small shift in notation that at first glance appeared almost insignificant. The assumption here, she said calmly, her voice carrying evenly across the silent hall, relies on stability across all intervals, but that only holds under constrained conditions. She drew a line beneath the expression, then extended the equation, her movements precise, unhurried, as if the outcome had already been decided long before she picked up the marker. When the boundary expands beyond that range, she continued, the transformation no longer maintains internal consistency. A faint stir moved through the audience, not laughter this time, but something more restrained, more focused, as if the room itself was beginning to catch up to what she was showing. A student in the second row leaned forward, his brows tightening, his earlier skepticism replaced by concentration. Another quietly pulled out a notebook, flipping pages, trying to follow the progression in real time. Emily did not acknowledge any of it. She continued writing, step by step, extending the logic outward, not just correcting the inconsistency, but exposing its ripple effect, how one flawed assumption quietly influenced everything that followed. Behind her, Whitmore's posture had changed, not dramatically, but enough to be noticed by those watching closely. His shoulders no longer rested as easily, his stance no longer as relaxed. His eyes tracked every movement of her hand now, not with casual oversight, but with careful scrutiny, as if searching for the point where she would lose control of the argument. But that moment did not come. Instead, Emily moved forward with increasing clarity, her voice steady, her explanation tightening, refining, until the structure on the board began to take on a different shape entirely, one that no longer aligned with the original model projected behind her. The contrast between the two became impossible to ignore. A quiet voice from the front row spoke up, almost involuntarily. That changes the entire outcome. The student murmured, not loudly, but loud enough in the silence to be heard. Emily did not turn. She simply continued, completing the final step with a small, deliberate motion, then setting the marker down gently against the tray. For a moment, nothing happened. No applause, no immediate reaction, just a stillness that felt heavier than anything that had come before. The projection screen still displayed Whitmore's original framework, clean, polished, confident. The board beside it now told a different story, one built on the same foundation, but leading to a completely different conclusion. Whitmore stepped forward slightly, his gaze fixed on the equations, his expression no longer composed in the same effortless way. He opened his mouth as if to respond, then stopped, his words catching somewhere between thought and certainty. The room waited, every eye shifting between him and the board, the weight of expectation pressing in from all sides. And in that moment, the authority he had carried so easily just minutes before no longer felt unquestioned. It felt tested. Whitmore's silence stretched just a fraction too long, long enough for the shift to become visible, not in any dramatic gesture, but in the subtle tightening of his expression, the slight narrowing of his eyes as he studied the board with a level of focus that no longer belonged to authority, but to verification. He stepped closer, his polished shoes echoing faintly as he moved beside Emily's work, his gaze tracing each line, each transformation, each conclusion she had laid out with quiet precision. For a moment, he said nothing. The room remained perfectly still, as if even the air had decided not to interfere. Then, finally, he spoke. "You adjusted the constraint parameters," he said, his tone measured, controlled, though no longer carrying the same effortless confidence. It was not a question. It was an observation, one that acknowledged what had been done without yet conceding what it meant. Emily stood slightly to the side now, her hands resting calmly at her sides, her posture relaxed, not defensive, not triumphant, simply present. Yes, she replied, her voice even. Because the original assumption does not hold under extended conditions. Whitmore nodded once, slowly, his gaze still fixed on the board. He reached for the marker, turning it between his fingers as if considering whether to respond in the same language she had used. The model was not designed for extended conditions, he said. Writing a small notation beside her work, his movements deliberate, his voice projecting again, though now with a subtle edge of caution. Its purpose was to demonstrate a specific controlled outcome. A few students nodded, relieved perhaps to hear something that sounded like control returning, like the familiar structure reasserting itself. But Emily did not step back. Then the conclusion should be presented as conditional, she said quietly. The words were simple, but they landed with weight. Whitmore paused, the marker hovering just above the board, his hand still. Behind him, the projection screen continued to display the original model, unchanged, confident, definitive. The contrast between that and what now stood on the board beside it had become unmistakable. A voice from the front row spoke again, this time clearer, more certain. She is right, the student said, glancing between the board and the screen. Another voice followed, then another, not loud, not disruptive, but enough to break the singular authority that had filled the room earlier. Whitmore straightened slowly, placing the marker back down with controlled precision, his movements careful, as if measured against something unseen. He turned slightly toward the audience, then back to the board, his expression composed, but no longer untouched. The silence that followed was different now. It was no longer built on expectation. It was built on recognition. He drew in a breath, preparing to speak again, but this time, there was a pause before the words came, a hesitation that had not existed before. And in that pause, something shifted permanently. Because in a room where authority had once gone unquestioned, doubt had now taken its place, quiet, undeniable, and impossible to reverse. The shift in the room did not happen all at once. It unfolded in quiet layers, like a realization settling into place across dozens of minds at the same time. And for the first time since the lecture began, Professor Whitmore was no longer the only voice that carried weight. He stood still for a moment, his gaze moving from the board to the audience, then back again, as if recalibrating not just the argument, but his position within it. The confidence that had once filled his posture had not vanished, but it had changed, tempered by something far less certain. The distinction between conditional and universal application. He began slowly, his voice measured, careful, is often a matter of interpretation within theoretical frameworks. The statement was composed, polished, but it lacked the sharp finality it once carried. Emily remained where she stood, her expression calm, her presence steady, not pressing, not retreating, simply allowing the moment to unfold without interference. A professor seated near the front row, a woman with silver-framed glasses and a reputation for precision, leaned forward slightly, her attention fixed on the board. Not when the model is presented as universally applicable, she said, her tone firm but controlled. The room absorbed her words instantly, the authority she carried adding weight to what had already begun to settle in the minds of those watching. Whitmore turned toward her, just briefly, acknowledging the comment with a nod that was almost imperceptible before returning his focus to the equations. The dynamic had shifted again, but this time it was undeniable. Emily did not move to reclaim the marker, did not step forward to reinforce her position. She simply stood, her hands loosely at her sides, as if the work itself spoke clearly enough without further explanation. The board, filled with her careful reconstruction, now stood as a quiet contrast to the projection behind it, the difference no longer subtle, no longer theoretical. A student in the middle rows raised his hand, hesitating only slightly before speaking. If the assumption fails outside the constrained interval, he said, choosing his words carefully, then the conclusion cannot be generalized the way it was presented. His voice was not confrontational, but it carried a clarity that echoed what many were already thinking. Whitmore listened, his expression composed, though the pause before his response stretched longer than before. That would depend, he began, but the words did not carry the same certainty, did not land with the same authority. Because now, the room was no longer listening in the same way. It was evaluating. It was questioning. It was seeing. Emily finally shifted her gaze slightly, not toward Whitmore, but toward the audience, her eyes moving across the room with a quiet awareness, as if acknowledging something that went beyond the equations on the board. She had not raised her voice, had not challenged with force or urgency, and yet the impact of what she had done was unmistakable. Whitmore stepped back from the board, just a small movement, but enough to create space, enough to signal something unspoken. The distance between him and the work in front of him was no longer just physical. It was symbolic. And in that space, the authority he had once commanded so effortlessly now stood on uncertain ground, not because it had been attacked, but because it had been revealed to be incomplete. The silence in the lecture hall no longer belonged to uncertainty. It had transformed into something heavier, something undeniable, as if the entire room had collectively crossed a threshold it could not return from. Professor Whitmore stood just a step removed from the board, his gaze no longer fixed in authority, but shifting, recalculating, searching for ground that no longer felt as stable as it had minutes before. The equations behind him remained unchanged on the projection screen, still polished, still confident, but now they carried a different weight, not as conclusions, but as something incomplete. A quiet rustle moved through the audience, not disruptive, but present, as students adjusted in their seats, exchanging glances that no longer held amusement, but recognition. One of the senior faculty members, seated near the aisle, leaned forward slightly, his expression thoughtful, his eyes moving carefully between the projection and Emily's reconstruction. The implications extend beyond a simple adjustment, he said, his voice calm but firm, cutting cleanly through the silence. If the assumption fails under broader conditions, then the model cannot be presented as universally applicable in its current form. The statement did not challenge Whitmore directly, but it did not need to. The weight of it settled into the room with quiet finality. Whitmore inhaled slowly, his shoulders rising just slightly before settling again, his composure still intact, but no longer untouched. He turned back toward the board, his eyes tracing the structure Emily had built, following each step as if seeing it for the first time, not as something to dismiss, but as something to confront. For a brief moment, he reached toward the marker again, his fingers brushing against it, then stopping, withdrawing, as if recognizing that any attempt to overwrite what was there would only deepen the contrast. The room noticed. It was a small movement, almost insignificant, but in a space where every detail now carried meaning, it spoke louder than any argument. Emily remained still, her presence quiet, her posture unchanged, not claiming the moment, not expanding it, simply allowing it to exist. She had said what needed to be said. She had shown what needed to be shown. There was nothing more to add. A student near the back whispered something to the person beside him, the words too soft to be heard, but the tone carried a shift, a kind of disbelief that had replaced the earlier certainty. Another student slowly lowered his phone, no longer recording out of amusement, but out of something closer to respect. Whitmore finally spoke again, but when he did, his voice no longer filled the room in the same way. "It appears," he said carefully, choosing each word with precision, "that the model may require further clarification in how its conclusions are framed." The phrasing was controlled, measured, an attempt to retain structure, to reshape the narrative without fully surrendering it. But the room understood. The acknowledgement, however subtle, had already been made. The authority that had once gone unquestioned had now been examined, not through confrontation, but through clarity. And clarity, once revealed, could not be undone. Whitmore stepped back another half step, the distance between him and the board widening just enough to make the shift visible to everyone watching. In that space, the balance of the room had quietly, irreversibly changed. No one spoke for several seconds after his words settled into the air, not because they were unclear, but because they were understood too well, and in that understanding, something irreversible had already taken place. The authority that once filled the room had not been shattered in a dramatic moment, but quietly reshaped, its edges softened by a truth that could not be dismissed or undone. Emily did not look toward Professor Whitmore again. Instead, she turned her attention back to the board for a brief moment, her eyes scanning the equations one last time, not with pride, not with hesitation, but with a quiet sense of completion. Then, without a word, she stepped away. The movement was simple, almost understated, yet in the stillness of the lecture hall, it carried a weight that no announcement could match. Her footsteps echoed softly as she walked past the front row, past the faculty who now watched her with a different kind of attention, one no longer shaped by dismissal, but by recognition. A professor near the aisle gave a small nod as she passed, not exaggerated, not performative, but genuine. Emily did not stop. She continued down the aisle, her posture the same as it had been when she entered, calm, composed, unchanged by the shift that had just unfolded around her. Behind her, Professor Whitmore remained near the board, his gaze no longer fixed outward, but inward, as if measuring something far more personal than the equations before him. The projection screen still displayed his original work, but no one was looking at it in the same way anymore. A few students began to whisper again, but this time the tone had changed completely, no trace of amusement remaining, only quiet discussion, analysis, and something closer to respect. One student flipped back through his notes, comparing lines, retracing steps, as if trying to understand how something so subtle had led to something so significant. Another sat back slowly, exhaling, his earlier confidence replaced by a thoughtful silence. The room did not erupt into applause. It did not need to. The silence itself had become the response. Whitmore finally turned away from the board, facing the audience once more, but the shift was unmistakable. His voice, when he spoke again, was steady, but different, no longer projecting certainty, but consideration. "We will revisit this model in our next session," he said, his tone measured, controlled, but lacking the final authority it once carried. It was not an admission of defeat, but it was not a dismissal either. It was something in between, something quieter, something more honest. Emily reached the back of the hall and returned to her seat, placing her notebook gently on her lap, as if nothing unusual had happened at all. She did not look around. She did not seek acknowledgement. She simply sat, the same quiet presence she had always been. But the room was no longer the same, because now, every person there had seen something they would not forget. Not just the correction of a model, but the quiet unraveling of an assumption, the kind that extends far beyond equations and into the way people choose to see one another. And in that moment, without raising her voice, without demanding attention, Emily Carter had reminded an entire room that true understanding does not announce itself loudly. It reveals itself when everything else falls silent.